The dust rose in clouds around Lillian Andrews' worn boots as she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk of Winnetka, Illinois, her stomach growling loud enough to embarrass her despite the bustling noise of the frontier town. It was August 1876, and she had traveled 3 weeks by wagon train to reach this growing settlement northwest of Chicago, carrying nothing but her late mother's silver locket, $20 sewn into her petticoat, and a determination that felt shakier with each passing hour. The town sprawled before her with all the chaos of westward expansion, even this far north. Buildings lined both sides of the muddy Main Street, a mix of freshly hewn timber structures and older establishments that had weathered several hard winters. A mercantile stood beside a land office, while across the street, a saloon's painted sign swung in the late summer breeze. Beyond the buildings, she could see the prairie stretching endlessly, golden grasses swaying like an ocean frozen in amber. Lillian clutched the small cloth bundle that contained her lunch, purchased that morning with precious pennies from a baker's widow on the edge of town. 2 thick slices of bread with butter and jam, an apple, and a piece of hard cheese. She had planned to make it last until evening, but hunger gnawed at her insides. She had eaten only scraps for the past 2 days, rationing what little remained of her funds. She found a relatively clean spot on a bench outside the general store and sat down carefully, mindful of the holes forming in her only good dress. As she unwrapped the cloth, the scent of fresh bread made her mouth water. She was raising the first slice to her lips when movement in the alley beside the store caught her attention. A small figure huddled there, pressed against the wall as if trying to become invisible. Lillian lowered her bread and looked more carefully. It was a boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with a dirt-smudged face and clothes that hung on his thin frame like rags on a scarecrow. His eyes, enormous in his gaunt face, were fixed on her lunch with the kind of desperate hunger that transcended mere appetite. Lillian's heart clenched. She knew that look. She had seen it in her own mirror often enough during the months after her mother died and the creditors had taken everything. The boy noticed her looking and immediately dropped his gaze, shrinking back further into the shadows. For a long moment, Lillian sat frozen, torn between her own gnawing hunger and the stark need she saw before her. She thought of the uncertain days ahead, of how far she would need to stretch her remaining money while she searched for work. The sensible thing would be to eat her lunch and preserve her strength. Instead, she stood and walked toward the alley. The boy watched her approach with wary eyes, ready to bolt like a frightened rabbit. She stopped a few feet away and held out the entire bundle of food. "I noticed you might be hungry," she said softly, keeping her voice gentle. "Would you like this?" The boy stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. His eyes darted between her face and the offered food, clearly expecting a trick. "Go on," Lillian urged, taking a step closer and setting the bundle on an upturned crate within his reach. "It is all right. I want you to have it." She backed away to give him space, and after another moment of hesitation, the boy lunged forward and grabbed the bundle. He retreated to his corner and tore into the bread with shaking hands, stuffing chunks into his mouth so fast Lillian worried he might choke. "Slow down," she said gently. "No one is going to take it from you." The boy barely seemed to hear her, too focused on the first real meal he had probably seen in days. Lillian watched him for another moment, her own stomach protesting its emptiness, then turned to go. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, she nearly collided with a tall figure who had been standing just at the edge of the alley. "Oh, forgive me," she gasped, stepping back quickly. The man steadied her with one hand, his other hand automatically touching the brim of his wide hat in a gesture of courtesy. "No harm done, miss." Lillian looked up into a face that made her breath catch in an entirely different way than hunger. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn leather vest, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, clear and deep. Dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked to be in his mid-20s, perhaps a year or two older than her own 22 years. But it was the expression in those creek water eyes that held her attention, something that looked like recognition, though she knew they had never met. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the complete propriety of his manner. "I saw what you did," he said quietly, nodding toward the alley where the boy was still devouring the food. "That was kind of you." Lillian felt her cheeks flush. It was nothing. The child was hungry. "So are you," the man observed, and there was no judgment in his tone, only a gentle certainty that made her wonder how he could possibly know. She lifted her chin, pride straightening her spine despite her worn dress and empty stomach. "I will be fine." The corner of his mouth quirked up, not quite a smile but something warmer than amusement. "I am sure you will be, but you might be fine with a full stomach just as easily as an empty one." He gestured toward the small restaurant across the street. "Would you allow me to buy you lunch? As thanks for reminding me that there is still grace in this world." Every lesson her mother had taught her about proper behavior with strangers rose up in protest. But Lillian's stomach growled audibly, and something in this man's steady gaze told her he meant no disrespect. There was a quality about him, something solid and honest that made her trust him despite their brief acquaintance. "I should not," she said, but her conviction wavered. "My name is Thomas Kane," he said, removing his hat entirely now, revealing that tousled dark hair completely. "I work the Morrison Ranch about 5 miles north of town. I am not a wealthy man, but I can afford to buy a meal for someone who just gave away her own lunch to feed a hungry child. No strings, no expectations, just one decent person helping another." The sincerity in his voice decided her. "Lillian Andrews," she said, extending her hand. "And I accept with gratitude." His hand enveloped hers, warm and calloused from hard work, and Lillian felt something spark between them, a connection she could not quite name. From the way Thomas's eyes widened slightly, she thought he felt it too. They crossed the street together, Thomas's hand hovering near the small of her back without quite touching, a protective gesture that felt natural rather than presumptuous. The restaurant was a simple establishment with wooden tables and benches, but it was clean and smelled gloriously of roasting meat and fresh bread. Thomas pulled out a chair for her before taking his own seat. A tired-looking woman in an apron approached, and Thomas ordered beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee for both of them without consulting the menu. "I hope that is acceptable," he said after the woman left. "The stew here is excellent, and it is the most filling thing on offer." "It sounds wonderful," Lillian said honestly. Now that she was sitting down in the warm restaurant, the full weight of her exhaustion seemed to settle over her. She had been running on determination and fear for so long, allowing herself to rest felt dangerous. Thomas was watching her with those observant eyes. "You are new to Winnetka." It was not a question, but Lillian nodded anyway. "I arrived this morning. I am looking for work." "What brings you here?" he asked, then immediately shook his head. "Forgive me, that is none of my business." "I tend to be too direct." "No, it is all right," Lillian said, surprised to find she did not mind his questions. "There is nothing scandalous to tell. My mother died 6 months ago in Ohio. We had nothing, and what little we did have went to pay her medical bills and debts. I heard there were opportunities out west, that towns were growing and needed people. A widow I knew was bringing her family here and allowed me to travel with her wagon for a small fee." "Do you have any trade?" Thomas asked. "I can read and write well. I was a teacher's assistant back home for 2 years before my mother took ill. I can also sew, cook, and keep accounts. I am hoping to find a position as a teacher or governess, or perhaps a clerk in a shop." The restaurant owner returned with their meals, setting down steaming bowls of thick stew rich with chunks of beef, carrots, and potatoes. The bread was still warm, and Lillian had to restrain herself from falling on the food the way the beggar boy had. Thomas noticed her restraint and smiled, a full, genuine smile this time that transformed his serious face. "Go ahead and eat. No one is watching except me, and I do not judge hunger." Lillian needed no further encouragement. She ate with as much decorum as her ravenous appetite allowed, but she did not hold back. The stew was delicious, hearty and perfectly seasoned, and the bread was soft inside with a crispy crust. It was the best meal she had eaten in months. Thomas ate his own food at a more measured pace, occasionally sipping his coffee. "There might be a teaching position available," he said after a while. "The settlement has been talking about hiring a proper schoolteacher. Right now, the children who get any education at all are taught by Reverend Stillwater's wife, and she has her hands full with 5 children of her own." Hope flared in Lillian's chest. "How would I apply for such a position?" "You would need to speak with the town council. They meet every Saturday at the land office. That would be 4 days from now." He hesitated, then continued. "Do you have a place to stay?" Lillian's brief hope dimmed. "Not yet. I was planning to inquire about boarding houses after I ate. There are 2 in town. Mrs. Ferguson runs one on the East End, and the Porter family has another on the West Side near the church. Both are respectable, but Mrs. Ferguson is cheaper and has better food." "Thank you," Lillian said warmly. "You have been very helpful." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and when Thomas paid the proprietor, he added an extra coin. "For the lady to take something with her," he said quietly. The woman nodded and wrapped 2 generous slices of pie in clean cloth, handing it to Lillian with a knowing smile. Lillian wanted to protest, but the practical part of her brain that had kept her alive these past months overruled her pride. She accepted the pie with grace. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Thomas walked beside her down the boardwalk, and Lillian found herself reluctant for their time together to end. "Thank you again for the meal," she said when they reached the general store where they had first met. "Your kindness will not be forgotten." "It was my pleasure," Thomas said, and meant it. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Miss Andrews, I wonder if I might call on you. Properly, I mean. Perhaps take you to the church social next week if you are still in town." Lillian's heart did an unexpected flutter. She barely knew this man, and yet something about him felt right in a way she could not explain. "I would like that very much, Mr. Kane." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "Please call me Thomas. Then you must call me Lillian." He smiled again, and Lillian thought she could get used to that smile, the way it made his eyes crinkle at the corners and softened his entire face. "Lillian," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. "It suits you." They stood there for another moment, neither quite willing to be the first to walk away. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I should get back to the ranch before dark, but I will be in town again on Saturday. Perhaps I could escort you to the council meeting." "I would appreciate that," Lillian said. Saturday seemed both impossibly far away and frighteningly soon. Thomas tipped his hat to her one final time, his eyes holding hers for a long moment that made her stomach flutter again. Then he turned and walked toward the livery stable where a bay horse was tied. Lillian watched him go, marking the easy confidence in his stride, the way he moved like a man comfortable in his own skin. She realized she was smiling and forced herself to turn away. She had more immediate concerns than a handsome cowboy with kind eyes. She needed to find Mrs. Ferguson's boarding house and secure a room for at least a few days. The boarding house was not hard to find. It was a two-story building that had been painted white some years ago, the color now faded to a soft gray. A sign in neat letters proclaimed it Ferguson House, clean rooms and good meals. Mrs. Ferguson herself answered Lillian's knock. She was a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to take Lillian's measure in seconds. "You are looking for a room?" "Yes, madam. I am new to town and need lodging while I search for employment." "Employment, is it?" Mrs. Ferguson's expression softened slightly. "You are not running from a husband or trouble?" "No, madam. I am alone in the world, looking to make an honest living." Something in Lillian's straightforward answer must have satisfied the older woman. "I have a small room on the second floor, $1 per week, includes breakfast and supper. You keep your own room clean, and I will not tolerate drinking, men visitors after dark, or any impropriety." "That sounds perfect," Lillian said, though her heart sank as she calculated how quickly her remaining money would disappear. Mrs. Ferguson led her upstairs to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table, and a chair. A single window looked out over the back garden. It was simple, but after weeks of sleeping in a wagon and on the ground, it looked like luxury. "Supper is at 6 sharp, Mrs. Ferguson said. "Do not be late or you will go hungry. Breakfast is at dawn. I run a Christian household and I expect my boarders at Sunday service." "Yes, madam, thank you." Left alone, Lillian sat on the bed and allowed herself a moment of relief. She had shelter at least for a week. She had the promise of a possible teaching position. And she had met someone, a man whose kindness and steady presence had stirred something in her she thought had died with her mother. She opened her carpet bag and took out her mother's locket, the only thing of value she had left. Inside were 2 tiny portraits, her mother and father, painted before Lillian was born. Her father had died when she was 3, kicked by a horse, leaving her mother to raise her alone on seamstress wages. "I am going to be all right, Mama," she whispered to the portrait. "I am going to make you proud." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Lillian visited every shop and business in Winnetka, inquiring about work. The mercantile owner said he would keep her in mind but had no immediate openings. The hotel had just hired a girl for their dining room. The dressmaker already had an assistant. Each rejection stung, but Lillian kept her chin up and her manner pleasant. She could not afford to show desperation, even though it gnawed at her insides every time she counted her dwindling funds. She saw Thomas twice in passing during those days. Once he was riding past on his bay horse, and he tipped his hat to her with that warm smile. Another time she spotted him loading supplies into a wagon outside the feed store. He was with 2 other ranch hands, but he excused himself when he saw her and crossed the street to greet her properly. "How goes the job search?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "Slowly," she admitted. "But I have not given up hope. Saturday's meeting will determine much." "You will do fine," he said with such confidence that Lillian almost believed him. "They would be fools not to hire you." His faith in her, unearned and absolute, warmed her more than she wanted to admit. They spoke for only a few minutes before he had to return to his work, but the encounter left Lillian smiling for the rest of the day. Saturday arrived with a cool morning that hinted at the approaching autumn. Lillian dressed in her best outfit, which was not saying much. Her brown dress was clean and pressed, but the fabric was thin from many washings, and the hem had been let down and taken up so many times there were visible lines in the cloth. Still, She looked respectable, and her hair was pinned up neatly beneath her simple bonnet. Thomas arrived at Mrs. Ferguson's house precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed in clean trousers and a shirt that looked new, his hair still damp from washing. Mrs. Ferguson answered the door and looked him over with an assessing gaze that would have made a lesser man squirm. "Thomas Kane," she said, recognition in her voice. "You work for Morrison, do you not?" "Yes, madam. I'm here to escort Miss Andrews to the council meeting." "Are you now, Mrs.?" Ferguson's tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. "See that you escort her there and back with no detours. I may be old, but I keep track of my girls." "Yes, madam, I would expect nothing less." Lillian descended the stairs, grateful that Mrs. Ferguson's protective instinct had been stirred rather than her suspicion. Having the boarding house owner's approval could only help her reputation in this new town. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "Good morning, Lillian. You look lovely." The compliment was simple and sincere, and it made her blush. "Thank you. Shall we go?" They walked together through the brightening morning, the town already bustling with Saturday activity. Farmers brought produce to sell. Women shopped with baskets over their arms, and children darted between buildings in games of tag. It was a vibrant community, and Lillian felt a growing hope that she might find a place here. The land office was already crowded when they arrived. The town council consisted of 5 men. The land office owner, Mr. Hargrove; Reverend Stillwater; the owner of the mercantile, Mr. Chen; a Chinese immigrant who had overcome significant prejudice to establish himself in the community, Dr. Pemberton; and a rancher named Mr. Morrison, Thomas's employer. Thomas introduced Lillian to Mr. Morrison first, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "So you are the young lady Thomas has not stopped talking about all week," he said with an amused glance at Thomas, who had the grace to look embarrassed. "I hope I live up to whatever he has said," Lillian replied diplomatically. "He tells me you gave away your lunch to a beggar child." "That speaks well of your character." Before Lillian could respond, Mr. Hargrove called the meeting to order. Lillian was invited to stand before the council, and she did so with her hands folded calmly in front of her, even though her heart was racing. "Miss Andrews, I understand you are interested in the teaching position," Reverend Stillwater began. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a gentle manner. "Yes, sir. I have experience as a teacher's assistant in Ohio, and I am well educated in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. I can also teach basic music if a piano is available." "Can you keep discipline?" Mr. Chen asked. His English was accented but perfect, and his dark eyes were shrewd. "Some of the older boys can be troublesome." "I believe in firm but fair discipline," Lillian said. "Children respond to structure and respect. If I treat them with dignity and hold them to high standards, they will generally meet those expectations." Dr. Pemberton leaned forward. "We have children of varying ages and abilities. Some families have recently arrived from other countries. How would you handle students who speak little English?" "Patience and creativity," Lillian answered. "Language is best learned through immersion and practice. I would pair non-English speakers with friendly classmates who could help them, and I would use visual aids and demonstrations to supplement verbal instruction." The council members exchanged glances. Mr. Morrison nodded approvingly. "You have given this thought." "Education is too important not to," Lillian said simply. They asked her several more questions about her background, her educational philosophy, and her expectations for the position. Lillian answered each query honestly and thoughtfully, drawing on her experience and her genuine love of learning. Finally, Reverend Stillwater stood. Miss Andrews, would you wait outside for a few minutes while we confer? Lillian agreed and stepped out onto the boardwalk where Thomas was waiting. He looked at her anxiously. How did it go? I do not know, Lillian admitted. They asked thorough questions. I answered as best I could. I am sure you were wonderful. They did not have long to wait. After only 5 minutes, Mr. Hargrove opened the door. Miss Andrews, would you join us again? Lillian's heart hammered as she re-entered the room. The 5 council members were all smiling. Miss Andrews, Reverend Stillwater said, we would like to offer you the position of schoolteacher for Winnetka. The salary is $40 per month, plus housing in the small cottage behind the church. School runs Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. You would be expected to attend Sunday services and to maintain appropriate moral standards as befits a teacher. Do you accept $40 a month? It was more than Lillian had dared hope. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. Yes, I accept with gratitude. The council members stood to shake her hand, each offering welcome and congratulations. Mr. Morrison held her hand a moment longer than necessary. My Thomas has a good eye for quality, he said quietly. I am glad you will be staying in Winnetka. When Lillian emerged from the land office this time, Thomas took one look at her face and broke into a wide grin. You got it. I got it, she confirmed, and then found herself laughing with pure relief. I start on Monday. They are giving me the rest of today and tomorrow to settle into the cottage and prepare. Without thinking, Thomas picked her up and spun her around, her feet leaving the ground. When he set her down, they were both laughing and several passers-by were smiling at their joy. Thomas seemed to realize what he had done and stepped back quickly, his face reddening. Forgive me, that was inappropriate. It was wonderful, Lillian said honestly. I cannot remember the last time I felt like celebrating. His smile returned, softer now but no less warm. Would you allow me to help you move into the cottage? It is probably dusty and needs airing out. I would appreciate that very much. They spent the rest of the day turning the small cottage into a home. It was a simple structure, just 2 rooms, one serving as a bedroom and the other as a sitting room with a small kitchen area. But it had glass windows, a good stove, and a roof that looked sound. More importantly, it was hers. Thomas proved surprisingly handy at domestic tasks. He repaired a loose shutter, fixed a sticking door, and climbed up to clear leaves from the chimney while Lillian swept and scrubbed inside. Mrs. Ferguson, hearing of Lillian's good fortune, sent over clean bedding and curtains with her blessing, and a reminder that Lillian was always welcome for meals until she was settled. Reverend Stillwater's wife, Emma, appeared in the afternoon with a basket of supplies: soap, candles, matches, tea, sugar, and a loaf of bread. She was a pleasant woman about Lillian's age, her belly round with her 6th child. Welcome to Winnetka, Emma said warmly. I cannot tell you how relieved I am that you are taking over the teaching. I have been trying to manage it alongside everything else, and I was doing none of it well. I hope I can live up to your standards, Lillian said. Emma laughed. My dear, if you can get the Halstead boys to sit still for more than 5 minutes, you will have exceeded my best efforts. Now, you must come to supper tomorrow after church. I want to tell you about each of the students and prepare you as best I can. By the time the sun began to set, the cottage looked livable. Thomas had brought in firewood and kindling, shown Lillian where the well was located, and pointed out which neighbors she could rely on in an emergency. They stood on the small porch, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and purple. Thank you for everything today, Lillian said quietly. You have done so much for me, and we barely know each other. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. When I saw you give that food to the beggar boy, when you did not hesitate even though you were clearly hungry yourself, something in me just knew." "Knew what?" Lillian asked softly. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "That you were someone special. Someone worth knowing. Someone worth—" He trailed off as if thinking better of what he had been about to say. "Worth what?" Lillian prompted, her heart racing. "Worth waiting for," he finished quietly. "I know it has only been a few days. I know this is too fast. But Lillian, I would very much like to court you properly, to see if what I feel growing between us is real." Lillian's throat felt tight. "What do you feel?" "Like I have been walking in the dark and just saw the sun rise," Thomas said simply. "Like something that was missing has clicked into place. Like you could share my life with the same grace you shared your lunch with that hungry child." The words should have seemed too much, too soon. But standing there in the twilight with this honest, kind man, they felt exactly right. "I feel it too," Lillian admitted. "It scares me how much I feel it after such a short time." "Then let us not be scared together," Thomas said, reaching out to gently take her hand. "Let us see where this leads, one day at a time." Lillian looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused from hard work, hers small and still bearing the redness of today's scrubbing. They fit together perfectly. "I would like that," she whispered. Thomas raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture both old-fashioned and achingly romantic. "Then I will call on you tomorrow after church if that is acceptable." "It is more than acceptable." He left reluctantly, and Lillian watched from her porch as he mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering darkness. Only when he disappeared from view did she allow herself to go inside, closing the door on her first real home and her first day of a new life. That night, lying in her own bed in her own house for the first time in her adult life, Lillian could hardly believe how much had changed in just 1 week. She had arrived in Winnetka hungry, homeless, and desperate. Now she had a position, a home, and the promise of something more with a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Lillian dressed carefully in her church dress, wishing she had something nicer but grateful for what she had. The church was a short walk from her cottage, and she arrived early enough to feel the curious stares of the congregation as they filed in. Thomas arrived with Mr. Morrison and his wife, a plump, cheerful woman who immediately swept Lillian into conversation and introduced her to what seemed like half the town. By the time the service began, Lillian's head was spinning with names and faces, but she felt welcomed in a way she had not expected. She spotted the beggar boy she had fed that first day, sitting in the back row beside an older woman who must have been his grandmother. He was clean now, wearing clothes that fit, and when he caught Lillian's eye, he gave her a shy smile that she returned warmly. Thomas sat across the aisle from her, and several times during the service, she caught him watching her with an expression that made warmth bloom in her chest. This was real, she thought. This connection between them was not just her imagination born of loneliness and need. After the service, Emma Stillwater was true to her word, insisting Lillian join them for Sunday dinner. Thomas was also invited, along with several other members of the congregation, and the Stillwater home rang with laughter and conversation. The meal was simple but abundant, and Lillian found herself relaxing in the warm atmosphere. Emma pulled her aside after dinner while the men talked outside and the children played. "Thomas Kane is a good man," she said without preamble. "One of the best I know. If he is courting you, you need not fear for your reputation or safety." "Thank you for telling me," Lillian said, grateful for the reassurance even though her instincts had already told her the same. "I see the way he looks at you," Emma continued, a knowing smile on her face. "And the way you look at him. It is a blessing to find that kind of connection. Do not let propriety or fear make you waste it. That afternoon, Thomas walked Lillian back to her cottage. The day was warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. They took their time, walking slowly and talking about everything and nothing. Thomas told her about growing up on a small farm in Indiana, the youngest of 4 boys. His parents had died in a fever epidemic when he was 17, and his older brothers had all married and moved away. He had drifted west, working various ranches, until he found a home with the Morrisons 3 years ago. "Mr. Morrison has no sons," Thomas explained. "He has been teaching me the business, letting me take on more responsibility. He has hinted that, when he is ready to retire in a few years, he would sell me a share of the ranch, make me a partner." "That is wonderful," Lillian said warmly. "You must work very hard to have earned his trust." "I try to be worthy of it," Thomas said simply. "What about you? What were your dreams before life became about survival?" Lillian was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I always loved learning," she said finally. "When I was young, I dreamed of going to a normal school, becoming a real teacher, but there was never money for that. When I became a teacher's assistant, I thought it was the closest I would get. Now, having my own school, my own students, it feels like more than I dared hope for." "You will be wonderful at it," Thomas said with certainty. "You have patience and kindness, but also strength." "That is a rare combination." They had reached her cottage, but neither seemed eager to part. They sat together on the porch steps, watching the afternoon sun paint the prairie gold. "May I ask you something?" Thomas said after a while. "Of course." "That first day when you gave away your lunch, did you know I was watching?" Lillian shook her head. "I had no idea anyone was there. I just saw a hungry child and knew I could not eat while he went without." "That is what I thought," Thomas said softly. "That is what made it so powerful. You were not trying to impress anyone or gain anything. You just saw a need and met it, even at cost to yourself." "It is what my mother would have done," Lillian said. "She always said that grace costs us nothing but means everything. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. I miss her every day." Thomas reached over and took her hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon stretched toward evening. It felt natural to be beside him, as if they had been doing this for years rather than days. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Thomas would ride into town every Sunday for church and spend the afternoon with Lillian. Sometimes they would walk along the creek that ran north of town. Sometimes they would sit on her porch and talk for hours. Occasionally, if the weather was fine, they would join other young people for social gatherings, and Lillian began to make friends among the other women in town. During the week, Lillian threw herself into teaching. Her students ranged from 5-year-olds just learning their letters to 14-year-olds preparing to leave school and take up adult work. She had 23 students in total, a mix of farm children, town children, and the offspring of immigrant families trying to build new lives on the prairie. The Halstead boys that Emma had warned her about turned out to be energetic rather than malicious, and Lillian found that giving them extra responsibilities and physical tasks channeled their energy productively. The younger children adored her, and even the skeptical older students slowly warmed to her patient instruction and genuine interest in their success. Teaching was exhausting work, but Lillian loved it. She loved the moment when a struggling reader suddenly unlocked the mystery of words. She loved teaching history and geography, showing her students that the world was vast and full of possibilities. She loved the trust parents placed in her and the progress she saw in even the most challenging students. One afternoon in late September, nearly a month after she had arrived in Winnetka, Lillian dismissed school and was cleaning the slates when she heard a knock at the schoolhouse door. She looked up to find Thomas standing there, his hat in his hands and an unusual nervousness in his expression. "Thomas, what a pleasant surprise," she said warmly. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, everything is fine," he said quickly. I wanted to talk to you about something, and I could not wait until Sunday." Lillian set down the slate she had been cleaning and gave him her full attention. "Of course. What is on your mind?" Thomas came further into the room, looking around at the neat rows of desks, the alphabet letters she had hung on the walls, the map of the United States she had purchased with her first month's wages. "You have done wonderful things with this place," he said. "The children are learning so much." "Thank you, but I do not think you rode all the way into town to compliment my teaching," Lillian said gently. "No," he admitted, meeting her eyes. "Lillian, I know we have only been courting for a short time. I know the proper thing would be to wait longer to give you more time to be certain, but I am certain, and I think you are too." Lillian's heart began to race. "Certain of what? That this is real, that what we have is rare and precious and worth building a life on." He crossed the space between them and took both her hands in his. "Mr. Morrison has officially offered to sell me a partnership in the ranch. I have been saving for years, and with his help I can afford it. I will have a real future, a real home to offer." "Thomas," Lillian whispered, seeing where this was going and hardly daring to believe it. "Lillian Andrews, I am not a poet. I cannot give you fancy words, but I can give you honesty. From the moment I saw you share your lunch with that beggar child, from the moment I saw the grace and kindness in your heart, I knew you were meant to be part of my life. I love you. I love your compassion, your strength, your intelligence, your determination. I love the way you treat every person with dignity, from the richest rancher to the poorest child. I love who I am when I am with you." Tears were streaming down Lillian's face now, happy tears that she made no effort to wipe away. "I know I am not rich and ranch life is hard work," Thomas continued. "But I promise I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you. I will build us a good home. I will support your teaching for as long as you want to continue. I will be faithful and true and do everything in my power to make you happy." He took a shaky breath. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Lillian said without hesitation. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her for the first time, it was tender and sweet and full of promise. Lillian melted into the embrace, feeling like she had finally come home. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling through tears. "I do not have a ring yet," Thomas admitted. "I wanted to ask you first, make sure you said yes before I spent the money," Lillian laughed. "I do not need a ring to know this is real." "You will have one anyway," Thomas insisted, "and a proper wedding if you want one." "Whatever you want, Lillian, I will find a way to give it to you. All I want is you," she said simply. "Everything else is just details." They talked for another hour, making plans and dreaming out loud. They decided on a December wedding, giving them time to prepare and for Thomas to finalize the partnership arrangements with Mr. Morrison. Lillian would continue teaching, at least for the next year, and they would build a house on the ranch property, close enough to town that her commute would be manageable. When Thomas finally left, Lillian stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched him ride away, her heart so full she thought it might burst. 2 months ago, she had been desperate and alone, with nothing but her mother's locket and a determination to survive. Now she had a home, a career she loved, and a future with a man who saw the best in her and brought out the best in himself. The next few months passed in a blur of happy preparation. Lillian continued teaching, and her students were thrilled when they learned their teacher was getting married. The girls begged to be flower girls, and the older boys offered to help with anything that needed doing. Emma Stillwater took Lillian under her wing, helping her sew a wedding dress from fabric that Thomas insisted on paying for. It was a simple design in soft cream cotton, but with Emma's skillful stitching and the lace that Mrs. Morrison donated from her own wedding dress, it became something beautiful. The women of Winnetka organized a wedding shower, and Lillian found herself the recipient of handmade quilts, preserves, kitchen implements, and 100 other useful items. The generosity of her new community moved her to tears more than once. Thomas was busy with ranch work and with the legal arrangements for his partnership. Mr. Morrison drew up contracts that gave Thomas a quarter share of the ranch immediately, with the option to buy another quarter when Morrison was ready to retire. It was more than generous, and Thomas worked doubly hard to prove he deserved the opportunity. He and Lillian spent every Sunday together, and Thomas began building their house on a pretty spot overlooking a stream on the ranch property. He built it with his own hands, with help from the other ranch workers and from men in town who had come to respect Lillian and were happy to support the match. It was a simple house, just 3 rooms to start with, but Thomas built it solidly and with love. Lillian visited the site every Sunday, watching the walls go up and the roof take shape, imagining their future within those walls. The wedding was set for December 15th, a Saturday. As the day approached, Lillian felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. She had no family to attend, no one to walk her down the aisle. Emma Stillwater assured her that the community would stand in for family, that she was not alone. The night before her wedding, Lillian sat in her little cottage for the last time, holding her mother's locket and thinking about how much had changed. "I wish you could be here tomorrow, Mama," she whispered to the portrait inside. "I wish you could meet Thomas. You would love him, I know you would. He is kind and honest and good. He sees the world the way you taught me to see it, as a place where grace and compassion matter." She slept fitfully, both excited for the next day and sad that her mother would not see it. When dawn came, Emma and several other women from town appeared at her door, ready to help her prepare. They heated water for a bath, helped her dress, and arranged her hair in an elegant style that Lillian would never have managed on her own. When she finally looked at herself in the small mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. The cream dress fit perfectly, highlighting her slender figure. Her dark hair was pinned up with small flowers woven through it, but it was her face that surprised her most. She glowed with happiness, her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed with excitement. "You look beautiful," Emma said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Thomas is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Lillian replied, meaning it. The wedding took place in the church, which had been decorated with evergreen branches and white ribbons. It seemed like the entire town had turned out for the occasion. Lillian walked down the aisle on Reverend Stillwater's arm, since he had volunteered to give her away, and her eyes immediately found Thomas waiting at the front. He wore a new suit, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven. But it was the expression in his eyes as he watched her approach that took her breath away. He looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever prayed, and Lillian knew she looked at him the same way. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever life brought. Thomas slipped a simple gold band on her finger, and Lillian placed a matching one on his. When Reverend Stillwater pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her, the church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration afterward was held in the town hall, which had been cleared of its usual furniture to make room for tables and dancing. There was food contributed by dozens of families, and someone had brought a fiddle, another a guitar. Music and laughter filled the space as Winnetka celebrated the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. Lillian danced with Thomas, with Mr. Morrison, with Reverend Stillwater, and with several of her older male students who bravely asked for the honor. She was hugged by more people than she could count, each one offering their congratulations and best wishes. As the evening wore on and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Thomas leaned down to whisper in her ear. "Would you like to go home, Mrs. Kane?" The sound of her new name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she whispered back. "Let us go home." They slipped away amid knowing smiles and well wishes. Thomas had borrowed a wagon for the occasion, and he helped Lillian up onto the bench seat before climbing up beside her. The ride to the ranch took half an hour, and they spent it wrapped in a warm blanket against the December cold, Lillian's head on Thomas's shoulder. The house was dark when they arrived, but Thomas had prepared for this moment. He lit lanterns that bathed the rooms in warm, golden light, revealing the furniture he had built and arranged. The main room had a sturdy table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and shelves waiting to be filled with books. The bedroom held a large bed with a beautiful quilt that Mrs. Morrison had made as a wedding gift. "It is perfect," Lillian breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Thomas, you built this for us." "I built it for you," he corrected, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Everything I do is for you now." That night, they began their life together in the home Thomas had built with his own hands. Lillian learned what it was to be loved completely, to be cherished and desired and treated like something precious. Thomas was gentle and patient, and by the time dawn crept through the windows, Lillian felt like she understood what marriage was meant to be. Two people becoming one, body and soul. The early months of their marriage were an adjustment. Lillian continued to teach, rising before dawn to help with morning chores before making the ride into town. Thomas insisted on accompanying her when his work allowed, and on the days he could not, she rode the gentle mare he had bought specifically for her use. Living on the ranch was different from town life. The work was constant and physical. Lillian learned to care for chickens, to milk cows, to maintain a large vegetable garden. She learned to cook for ranch hands during busy seasons, to preserve food for winter, to mend work clothes that took a beating from daily labor. But she also learned the joys of ranch life. She loved the vast open spaces, the endless sky, the freedom of riding across the prairie with Thomas on Sunday afternoons. She loved falling asleep in his arms every night and waking up beside him every morning. She loved building a life with him, piece by piece, day by day. Thomas was everything a husband should be. He was patient with her learning curve as she adjusted to ranch life. He supported her teaching and never complained about the extra work her career created for him. He was affectionate and attentive, making her feel loved and valued every single day. Their first real test came in March, when late winter storms hit hard. Lillian was trapped in town for 3 days, staying with Emma Stillwater while the roads were impassable. She worried constantly about Thomas, about whether he was safe and warm. When the weather finally cleared and he came to town to fetch her home, she threw herself into his arms with such force she nearly knocked him over. "I was so worried," she said against his chest. "I am fine," he assured her, holding her tight. "The storm was bad, but we did not lose any animals and the house stood strong. I told you I built it to last." "I know, but I could not stop imagining all the things that could go wrong." Thomas pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "That is what love is, I suppose. Giving someone the power to worry you because you cannot imagine life without them." "Then I love you very much," Lillian said. because these past 3 days have been miserable. For me too, Thomas admitted. The house felt empty without you. I never want to sleep alone again. Spring brought new life to the ranch and new students to Lillian's classroom. She had been teaching for nearly a year now, and the transformation in her students was visible. Reading scores had improved dramatically. Even the children from non-English-speaking families were now fluent. Several of her older students were talking about continuing their education, dreams that would have been impossible without the foundation she had provided. The town council increased her salary by $5 per month in recognition of her excellent work, and Lillian felt a deep satisfaction in knowing she was making a real difference. In May, Lillian began to suspect she might be pregnant. She had been feeling tired and slightly nauseous in the mornings, and her monthly courses were late. She said nothing to Thomas at first, not wanting to get his hopes up until she was certain. But when another month passed with the same symptoms, she made an appointment with Dr. Pemberton. He confirmed what she had suspected. She was definitely pregnant, probably about 2 months along, which meant the baby would arrive in early January. Lillian left the doctor's office in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach. A baby. She and Thomas were going to have a baby. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She wanted this desperately, but she also remembered how hard her mother had worked to raise her alone, how much she had sacrificed. But I am not alone, Lillian reminded herself. I have Thomas. We will raise this child together. She waited until that evening to tell him, after supper when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Thomas, I have something to tell you. He looked at her with immediate concern. Is something wrong? Are you ill? No, nothing is wrong, quite the opposite, actually. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We are going to have a baby. Thomas's eyes widened, his mouth falling open in shock. A baby, truly, truly. Dr. Pemberton confirmed it this afternoon. The baby should arrive in January. A baby, Thomas repeated, and then his face split into the widest smile Lillian had ever seen. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around just like he had the day she got the teaching job. When he set her down, there were tears in his eyes. We are going to be parents. Lillian, we are going to have a family. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, we are. That night, Thomas held her close and talked about all his dreams for their child. He wanted to be a good father, the kind who was present and involved. He wanted to teach their child to ride, to work hard, to treat people with respect. He wanted to give their child opportunities he had never had. Our child will be loved, Lillian said softly. That is the most important thing. As long as we love this baby and each other, everything else will work out. You are right, Thomas agreed, kissing her forehead. You are always right. Lillian continued teaching through the fall, though she had to let out her dresses as her belly grew. The children were fascinated by her pregnancy, and the older girls especially wanted to know everything about babies. Lillian used it as a teaching opportunity, discussing biology and human development in age-appropriate ways. In December, she reluctantly told the school board that she would need to stop teaching after the new year to focus on the baby. They were disappointed but understanding, and they began the process of finding a replacement. Her last day of teaching was emotional. The students had organized a surprise party, with gifts they had made themselves. Drawings, a quilt with squares sewn by each child, a rocking cradle that the older boys had built in secret with their father's help. Lillian cried happy tears and hugged each student, telling them how much they had meant to her and how proud she was of all they had accomplished. Christmas was quiet but perfect. Lillian and Thomas exchanged small, meaningful gifts. She gave him a leather-bound journal for tracking ranch business, and he gave her a beautiful wooden box he had carved himself to hold her mother's locket and other treasures. They attended Christmas service in town and had dinner with the Morrisons, who were now like family. The baby came 3 weeks later, on a cold January night when wind howled around the house. Emma Stillwater and Dr. Pemberton attended the birth, along with Mrs. Morrison, who had delivered 5 children of her own and was a calming presence throughout the long labor. Thomas paced outside the bedroom for hours, refusing to leave the house despite Emma's suggestion that he go work off his nervous energy. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard the sound he had been waiting for. A baby's cry, strong and indignant. Emma emerged from the bedroom, her face tired but happy. "You have a son, Thomas. A beautiful, healthy boy." Thomas pushed past her into the room, where Lillian lay exhausted but radiant in the bed, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when he entered, and the love in her eyes took his breath away. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Thomas approached slowly, almost reverently. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny red face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused dark eyes. He had a shock of black hair and the most perfect tiny features Thomas had ever seen. "He is beautiful," Thomas whispered. "Just like his mother." "What should we name him?" Lillian asked. They had discussed names for months but had never quite decided. Thomas looked at his son, at his wife, at the family they had created together. "What about Samuel? It means heard by God. Our prayers were heard, Lillian. We found each other when we both needed someone most. This little one is proof that good things can come from hard times." "Samuel," Lillian repeated, testing the name. "Samuel Kane, I love it." Samuel proved to be a relatively easy baby, or perhaps Thomas and Lillian were just naturally suited to parenthood. He nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and seemed content as long as one of his parents was nearby. Thomas was devoted from the first moment, getting up with Lillian for night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending every spare moment simply staring at his son in wonder. Lillian found that she did not miss teaching as much as she had expected. Caring for Samuel fulfilled something deep in her soul. She loved watching him discover the world, loved his first smile and his first laugh. She loved the way Thomas interacted with him, so gentle and patient despite his rough cowboy exterior. Mr. Morrison, who had no grandchildren of his own, doted on Samuel shamelessly. Mrs. Morrison knitted enough blankets and sweaters to clothe 10 babies. Emma Stillwater brought her children to visit regularly, and the older Stillwater kids adored baby Samuel, fighting over who got to hold him. As Samuel grew from infant to baby to toddler, Lillian and Thomas's love deepened. They had moved past the initial passionate romance into something richer and more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering commitment. They had learned to work together, to communicate through disagreements, to support each other through challenges. When Samuel was 2, they learned they were expecting again. This time, the pregnancy felt easier, perhaps because Lillian knew what to expect. She gave birth to a daughter in October, a tiny girl with Thomas's green eyes and Lillian's delicate features. They named her Grace, after the quality that had first drawn Thomas to Lillian. "You shared your life with me with grace," Thomas said, holding his daughter for the first time. "It seems fitting." The years flowed by, marked by the rhythm of ranch life and the milestones of growing children. Samuel grew tall and strong, fascinated by horses and cattle. He followed his father everywhere, learning the ranch business from the time he could walk. Grace was quieter but no less determined. She loved books like her mother and showed an early aptitude for learning. When Samuel was 5 and Grace was 3, Lillian began teaching again, this time just 3 days a week. The new teacher who had replaced her had married and moved away, and the town was desperate for someone to take over. Thomas supported her decision completely, adjusting his work schedule to be home with the children on the days Lillian taught. In 1885, when they had been married 9 years, Mr. Morrison decided it was time to retire. He sold his remaining share of the ranch to Thomas, who became full owner. It was both exciting and terrifying. Thomas was only 32, but he had proven himself more than capable of running the operation. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management. He was fair to his workers, innovative in his methods, and respected by other ranchers in the region. He and Lillian expanded the house, adding more bedrooms and a proper dining room where they could host the gatherings that became increasingly common as their social circle grew. They had 2 more children, a son named Henry in 1887 and another daughter, Ellen, in 1890. Their house was full of noise and laughter, of muddy boots and skinned knees, of homework and bedtime stories and Sunday dinners with more people crammed around the table than it was designed to hold. Through it all, Thomas and Lillian remained each other's anchor. They still took walks together on Sunday afternoons when they could escape the demands of children and ranch. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day. They still looked at each other across a crowded room and felt that same spark they had felt the day they met. One evening in late 1895, after the children were in bed, they sat together by the fireplace. Thomas was reading a ranching journal while Lillian mended a shirt. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she knew well. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "About that day 20 years ago when I saw you give your lunch to that beggar boy," Thomas said. "About how I knew in that moment that you were someone special. I remember thinking you were presumptuous for buying me lunch when we had just met," Lillian said with a smile. "And yet you accepted. How could I not? You looked at me like I was the only person in the world." "You were," Thomas said simply. "You still are." He set aside his journal and came to sit beside her on the sofa. She put down her mending and leaned into him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "I cannot imagine my life without you," Lillian said quietly. "When I arrived in Winnetka, I was so lost and scared. I had nothing. And then I met you, and everything changed." "You changed everything for me too," Thomas replied. "I was just going through the motions, working hard but not really living. You taught me what it means to truly love someone, to build a life together, to create something beautiful out of nothing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling and the sounds of the prairie night drifting through the windows. Finally, Lillian spoke again. "Do you know what I love most about our life together?" "What?" "That it is ours. We built it together from nothing. This house, this ranch, our children, our place in this community. None of it was handed to us. We earned it through hard work and love and refusing to give up on each other. And through grace," Thomas added. "The grace you showed that hungry child, the grace you have shown me every day since. The grace that defines everything you do." Lillian turned to look at him, her eyes shining. "We were both hungry that day, Thomas. I was hungry for food, but you were hungry for something more, for connection, for meaning, for love. And you fed both kinds of hunger," Thomas said, cupping her face in his hands. "You shared your lunch with a beggar, and in doing so, you showed me who you really were. That moment changed my entire life." "It changed both our lives," Lillian corrected. "I think we were meant to find each other that day. All the hardship and loss that brought me to Winnetka, all the years you spent searching for a place to belong, it all led to that moment outside the general store." Thomas kissed her then, deep and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and commitment and shared experiences. When they finally broke apart, They were both smiling. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and inevitable sorrows. Mr. Morrison died peacefully in his sleep in 1897, and Thomas grieved like he had lost his own father. Mrs. Morrison followed 2 years later, and the ranch that had been their legacy was now fully Thomas and Lillian's responsibility. Samuel grew into a fine young man, eventually marrying the daughter of a neighboring rancher in 1899. He and his wife built a house on the far edge of the Kane Ranch property and began raising their own children. Grace became a teacher like her mother, taking over Lillian's position when Lillian finally retired at age 50. Henry showed an aptitude for business and eventually handled all the financial aspects of the ranch. Ellen, the baby, surprised everyone by becoming a nurse, traveling to Chicago for training and returning to serve the growing Winnetka community. Thomas and Lillian became grandparents, then great-grandparents. They aged together gracefully, Thomas's dark hair turning silver, Lillian's slim figure becoming rounder and softer. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, tempered by shared trials and sweetened by shared triumphs. On their 40th wedding anniversary in December 1915, their children and grandchildren organized a celebration at the ranch house. The place was packed with family and friends. 3 generations gathered to honor a marriage that had become legendary in Winnetka. Samuel stood to give a toast, raising his glass high. To my parents, Thomas and Lillian Kane. 40 years ago, they took a chance on love. They built this ranch, raised 4 children, and created a legacy that will continue for generations. More importantly, they showed all of us what real love looks like: patient, kind, enduring, and full of grace. Everyone drank to the toast, and then Grace stood. "Most of you know the story of how my parents met," she said. "How my mother gave her lunch to a hungry child, and my father saw it and knew he had found someone special. That moment of compassion and generosity set the tone for their entire marriage. They have spent 40 years sharing what they have with others, whether it is food, time, wisdom, or love. They made Winnetka a better place, and they made all of us better people by their example." More toasts followed, each one highlighting different aspects of Thomas and Lillian's life and impact. When it was finally their turn to speak, Thomas and Lillian stood together, his arm around her waist. "We cannot take credit for much," Thomas said. "We simply loved each other and tried to treat others the way we wanted to be treated. Everything else grew from that. 40 years ago, I was alone and frightened," Lillian added. "I had lost everything and was trying to start over in a strange place. Then I met this man, and he saw me, really saw me, not as a charity case or a problem to solve, but as a person with value and worth. He gave me the courage to believe I could build a good life. Together, we did more than I ever imagined possible." She turned to look at Thomas, tears shining in her eyes. "You are still my best friend, my greatest love, my partner in all things. Thank you for choosing me all those years ago." "Thank you for sharing your life with me," Thomas replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "With grace, just as I knew you would." They kissed to thunderous applause, and the party continued late into the night. But eventually, the guests departed. The grandchildren were collected by their parents, and Thomas and Lillian found themselves alone in the quiet house. They walked through the rooms together, looking at the photos on the walls, the mementos of 40 years of marriage. Baby pictures, wedding photos, snapshots of family gatherings, a life lived fully and well. "You have any regrets?" Lillian asked as they prepared for bed. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I regret that we could not save more children like that beggar boy." I regret the years of drought that were so hard on the ranch and our workers. I regret the times I was short-tempered or let my pride get in the way of apologizing quickly." "Those are small things," Lillian observed. "Because the big things were all right," Thomas agreed. "I do not regret marrying you. I do not regret any of our children or the life we built. I do not regret staying in Winnetka or buying the ranch or any of the major decisions we made together." "Neither do I," Lillian said softly. "If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single important thing." They climbed into bed, the same bed that Thomas had built for their wedding night 40 years earlier. It had been repaired and refinished over the years, but it was still solid, still theirs. They lay in each other's arms as they had done thousands of times before, comfortable and content. "I love you," Thomas murmured as sleep began to claim him. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Lillian replied. "Always and forever." The years after their 40th anniversary were peaceful ones. Thomas gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Samuel and Henry, though he never fully retired. He loved the work too much, loved the animals and the land and the rhythm of ranch life. Lillian spent her days with grandchildren, reading and gardening and serving on various community boards. She was respected as one of the founding mothers of modern Winnetka, a woman who had helped shape the town's values and priorities. In 1922, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. At 70 years old, his body struggled to fight the infection. For 2 weeks, Lillian barely left his bedside, holding his hand and reading to him and reminding him of all the reasons he needed to stay with her. Their children took turns keeping vigil, but it was Lillian that Thomas wanted most. He recovered, but the illness left him weakened. He moved more slowly, tired more easily. But his mind remained sharp and his love for Lillian never wavered. If anything, the brush with death made him even more appreciative of each day they had together. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in December 1925. The party was smaller this time, more intimate. Many of their old friends had passed away, and Thomas was not strong enough for a large celebration. But their children and grandchildren gathered, and they renewed their vows in a simple ceremony that left no dry eye in the room. 50 years, Lillian marveled that night as they sat together by the fire. "Half a century we have been married. Best 50 years of my life," Thomas said. His voice was weaker now, but his conviction was strong. "Mine too," Lillian agreed. She looked at her husband, seeing past the aged exterior to the young man who had bought her lunch all those years ago. "I would marry you again tomorrow if I could." "No need," Thomas said with a smile. "We got it right the first time." Thomas lived 3 more years, long enough to meet several great-great-grandchildren and to see the ranch transition fully to the next generation. He died peacefully in his sleep in February 1928, with Lillian beside him holding his hand. His last words to her were, "Thank you for sharing your life with me." Lillian grieved deeply but not desperately. She had been blessed with 52 years of marriage to a man who loved her completely. They had built a beautiful life together, raised wonderful children, and left a legacy that would continue for generations. That was more than most people ever got. She lived another 12 years, remaining active in the community and devoted to her family. She loved being surrounded by children and grandchildren, loved telling stories about the old days and watching Winnetka grow from a frontier settlement into a thriving town. When people asked her the secret to a long, happy marriage, she always gave the same answer: grace. Show grace to each other, especially in hard times, and never stop seeing each other as you did in the beginning, with fresh eyes and an open heart. Lillian died in her sleep in 1940 at the age of 86. Her children found her in the big bed she had shared with Thomas, her mother's locket clutched in her hand, and a peaceful expression on her face. The entire town turned out for her funeral. 3 generations of students she had taught coming to pay their respects to the woman who had shaped so many lives. She was buried beside Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large oak tree they had planted together on their 10th anniversary. The headstone was simple but perfect. Thomas and Lillian Kane. They shared their lives with grace. Years later, when their great-grandchildren asked about them, the stories always began the same way. It started when your great-grandmother gave her lunch to a beggar. Your great-grandfather was watching, and he knew right then that she was someone special, someone who would share not just her food but her whole life with grace and generosity. He was right. They built something beautiful together, and that beauty continues in all of us. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, all because of one moment of compassion on a dusty street in Winnetka, Illinois. One woman who chose kindness over self-preservation. One man who recognized that grace when he saw it and had the courage to pursue it. One love story that proved that sometimes the best things in life begin with the simplest acts of human decency. The Kane Ranch still operates today, still run by descendants of Thomas and Lillian. The house has been expanded and modernized, but the original 3 rooms that Thomas built with his own hands are preserved, a monument to where it all began. Family members make pilgrimages there, walking the same halls where Thomas and Lillian laughed and loved and raised their children. They stand on the porch where the couple sat so many evenings, watching sunsets and talking about their day. They sleep in guest rooms and wake to prairie views that have not changed much in over a century. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind is just right, people swear they can feel the presence of Thomas and Lillian still lingering in that house they built together, their love so strong it transcended death itself. A reminder that true love, built on grace and compassion and unwavering commitment, never really dies. It just transforms, becoming part of the foundation upon which future generations build their own lives and loves. The story of Thomas and Lillian Kane became more than family history. It became a legend in Winnetka, a reminder of what the town was built on: hard work, compassion, and the courage to take chances on love. Their story was taught in schools, referenced in sermons, and invoked at weddings as an example of what marriage should be. But for those who knew them personally, for the children and grandchildren who experienced their love firsthand, the story was simpler and more profound. It was about 2 people who found each other when they each needed someone most, who chose each other every day, through good times and hard times, who built a life together from nothing but love and determination, who proved that grace is not just something you show to strangers, but something you bring to every aspect of life, especially marriage. In the end, Thomas had been right that first day. Lillian had shared his life with grace, just as he knew she would, and he had spent every day of his life grateful for that gift, working to be worthy of the woman who had chosen him. Together, they had created something that lasted long after they were gone. A family, a legacy, and a love story for the ages. Their story serves as proof that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. That one moment of compassion can ripple out into the world in ways we never imagine. That choosing to help someone in need, even at cost to ourselves, can lead to blessings beyond our wildest dreams. And it reminds us that true love is not just about passion or romance, though Thomas and Lillian had plenty of both. True love is about seeing someone's essential goodness and choosing to build a life around that goodness. It is about grace in all its forms: grace under pressure, grace in daily interactions, grace in forgiving mistakes, grace in celebrating triumphs, grace in weathering sorrows, and grace in sharing everything you have and are with another person. That is what Thomas saw when he watched Lillian give her lunch to a beggar child. That is what made him know with absolute certainty that she would share his life with the same grace. And that is what made their love story one worth remembering, retelling, and learning from for generations to come.